you change the world you live in phenomenologically, psychologically, by changing what you aim at. And the reason for that is that you can't see much of the world. There just isn't enough of you. You have to ignore most of the world. I mean, obviously, you're not paying attention to what's going on in the country next to you in any real sense. So, for example, I mean, the fact that you're localized right here and right now means there's all sorts of things that you just physically can't attend to. But even in the space you're in, you're basically blind to everything that isn't serving the purpose that you're aiming at. So that's worth thinking about. If you're blind to everything that isn't serving the purpose that you're aiming at, and you can't see anything good, then one potential conclusion is that you're not aiming at the right thing, because there's lots of things in the world that could manifest themselves to you. And I really mean this physically. It's a physical thing as well as a psychological thing. And so if all you see in the world is frustration, misery, cruelty, tragedy, and malevolence, and that's crushing you, then you can ask yourself, well, are you so certain that you're aiming at the right thing? Now, I'm not saying that all people suffering is a consequence of the inappropriateness of their aims. I think that's a big mistake, because there's an element of life that's sort of ineradicably arbitrary. Then that's...
You mean the randomness of the universe, basically?
Yeah, well, the fact that bad things happen to good people, it's basically as simple as that. Or terrible things happen to good people even. Or even that terrible things happen to bad people. There's a randomness element to it. And you don't want to get too high on your horse about that and assume that, if something bad happened to you, it's because it's your fault. Sometimes it's your fault. And sometimes there's something you could do to decrease the probability that will happen again. But sometimes you're just, you got hit by a bus and the bus jumped the curb, and that's just how it is. But having said that, you don't want to underestimate the degree to which you can change the way the world manifests itself to you by changing what you're aiming at. So then the question, of course, becomes, well, what should you aim at? And the first answer to that is, I should aim at something, right? Something, that's the first rule. Aiming at something is better than not aiming at something. So I wrote a fair bit about that in 12 Rules for Life too. There's a rule in there that says compare yourself to who you were yesterday instead of who someone else is today. That's something that you can aim at. Even if you don't know what's up, you might be able to think, or what direction up is, you might be able to think, well, I'm reasonably aware of some of my flaws, and not flaws necessarily by other people's reckoning, although that too, but flaws by your own, that you've identified by your own internal sense of orientation, things about yourself that you're dissatisfied with that you could change. It's like, well, you could start changing those, like in small ways. That turns out to be way more powerful than people think. Not only do you start to outline what your aims might be, but you also start to treat yourself like you're the sort of person who can have aims. And that's a real revelation for many people, because they believe consciously or implicitly that life is something that happens to you. And fair enough, there's an element of life that happens to you, but it doesn't life doesn't happen to you any more than when you're captaining a ship, the ocean takes you where it wants to go, right? Sometimes the ocean takes you where it wants to go, and sometimes that's to the bottom of the ocean. But if you have a seaworthy ship and you're a decent captain, then you can make your way across the ocean, even if there's a storm. And that's a good metaphor, that sailing metaphor. It's also why I think people love sailing so much, because it has that metaphorical or metaphysical reality to it, as well as being something practical.
Plus the promise of bounty behind the horizon, probably, if you start moving towards a particular goal.
Yeah, well, that's it. And it's also it's a bounty that can increase as you progress towards it as well. It's like, well, I'd like things to be slightly better than they are today.
Yeah.
Okay, well, then tomorrow will be a little better, and then what you're aiming at is a little, grander, nobler, grander, both of those things.
You've improved your position, and that feels good in itself, and that gives you a sense of control, I think.
And a sense of hope, because if you've done it once, even a bit, you think, oh, well, I did it once, I can probably do that much again, maybe I could even do more. And maybe if I practiced hard for like 10 years, I might get really good at this. And the thing is, people do get really good at it. They get amazingly good at it. And then you meet people now and then who, like, they're very astute captains of very powerful and fast ships. You think, well, how do you get there? It's, well...
Incrementally, probably.
Yes, incrementally.
You start with a raft and
Yeah.
you start building towards that speedboat. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And it helps to be healthy, and it helps to not have tragedy befall you, and all of those things. You need good fortune. You need to avoid the hurricanes to keep the metaphor going.
Although sometimes I wonder if sometimes you need the hurricanes to become a better captain, because a lot of the people that I've met that are really highly focused and goal-oriented also have some past trauma in their lives, that something happened to them that showed them that, well, life can be a bitch. And sometimes it's rough. And that sort of hardened them to do the things that they need to do in order to get to their goals.
Yeah, well, that's
a little bit better.
Yeah, that's an initiation process. Well, it is really useful to know the difference between something terrible and something unfortunate. You know, and you need to have had a terrible experience before you can really distinguish between those two. And then you have to learn that, well, it helps you learn what you should be worried about and what you shouldn't be worried about, but it also helps you know that you're tougher than you think you are. We brought students into the college during their orientation day in the middle of the summer, and we had them do their future authoring program where they lay out their vision for their friendships and their education and their career goals and the plan that they might want to implement to deal with temptations like drug and alcohol use, and their use of free time, their productive use of free time, and their physical and mental health, and asked them to write about what their life could be like in 3 to 5 years if they were treating themselves properly and were on a good pathway, and then also to write about how terrible their lives could be if they let their bad habits. And the effect of that, even they only wrote for an hour, the effect of that was that they were about 35% more likely to stay in school. Have a kind of notion of something like hell that's very well developed in Christianity. And so hell is where you end up when you lie. That's one way of thinking about it, in a very good way. You might think, well, is there any psychological utility in that idea? And the answer is, yeah. You need to know where you could end up if things went wrong, because then you're motivated by fear to move forward. If you're not motivated by fear to move forward, then your fear's in front of you stopping you. Because you might think, oh my God, I can't take the risks necessary to attain these goals. What if something goes wrong? Well, it's like, yeah, well then you're frozen. But if you think, no, wait a second. There's risks to proceeding, but nothing compared to the risks of failing. So then the fear is behind you, pushing you forward. That's so you need a vision of hell. It's like, okay, what's your personal vision of hell? You let your life fall apart because of your own stupidity and your own blindness. It's like you're the worst place you could be in 5 years. Well, that's what we ask people to write about.
There's works.
Nothing like consulting your existential terror. You know, and you think, well, I'd rather go out and party tonight. I shouldn't be working on this. I'd rather go out and party. It's like, well, why not? It's like, oh yeah. Arithmetic helps too.
In which sense?
Well, this is something I've done with big groups of students and my clients as well. It's like, okay, I ask students in particular between the ages of, say, 18 and 20. It's like, well, how much time do you waste in a day? Is it an hour? And people say no. Is it like 4 hours? No. 10? No. It's usually about 6. I can get a group of 200 students to agree that they're just wasting 6 hours a day. No, and by their own definition of wasting, right? So, okay. So then we do some mathematics with that. We've got the 6. That's fine. 6 hours a day. Okay. So that's 40 hours a week. All right. So then I think, well, what's your time worth? And they think, well, minimum wage, because, most of the students, if they went out and worked, they'd only get minimum wage. But that's not right, because that's a discounted version. Their time is worth way more than that if they're working on something useful, because it's an investment. So it's perfectly reasonable to assume that if you're a reasonably bright student, your time is worth $25 an hour, something like that, because of its potential for future payoff. It's okay. Well, that's $1,000 a week. Right. So it's $4,000 a month. It's $50,000 a year. In 4 years, it's $200,000. So that's what wasting your day is costing you. It's like, let's make no mistake about it. You're going to be $200,000 poorer in 4 years because you're wasting your time. Is that really what you want to do? You're rich enough so that you're willing to forego that $200,000. Well, no one's ever sat them down and said, look, put an estimate out of the value of your time. Figure out how much of it you're wasting, and then ask yourself if you really think that that's a good idea.